Welcome. This is the article critique for Introduction to Environmental Health. The article I chose for this is the Occupational Lead Exposure and Associations with Selected Cancers, the Shanghai Men's and Women's Health Study Cohorts. My name is Paul Vaona, and let's talk about why I'm here. Well, it would be easy to say that it was the first article that I chose, or the first one that came up on the consortium library website, which is true, although it's kind of partial true. One of my jobs several years back was I was a paramedic at a remote site, paramedic and a firefighter for a gold mine, and part of my duties was part of the lead tracking for those employees that had an occupational exposure. I would take the blood samples and send them off, and then I worked with the occupational doc, who actually became a kind of a mentor towards me, and kind of gave me a better understanding of lead exposures. One of the things that comes to mind, learning about how we encounter lead on a daily basis. We talked about, even my loading ammunition puts me in contact with lead. People that work in the tire industry, changing tires with the balancing weights are lead. We actually had one employee that lived in an area of Montana that I actually spoke of in one of my bulletin board posts that had a significantly higher baseline lead level simply because of where he lived. So that's my reason for being here. I think one of the reasons also we need to talk about is why the researchers chose this topic. Lead is a known toxin. We are very aware of the damage that it causes as a toxin. However, the connections to cancers is a little bit less known. And a lot of the studies are inconsistent, which we will talk about later. It has been used in gasoline and paint, though those have been phased out, at least in the United States and Europe. But lead is still a significant presence in industry. As we become more prone towards living green, we need to store that energy that our country wants to gather solar and wind power. Invariably, that's going to be batteries, and the biggest ones are lead acid batteries. So there is still a large industry for production and for recycling of lead. Talk about what lead is. Lead obviously is a heavy metal. We have archaeological evidence that shows that it was first smelted back to the 7000 BCs. It was used in a lot of things. The Romans used it as part of their plumbing. It was used in welding, soldering of cans of food, and anecdotally, both of these have been attributed to the demise, one of the Roman Empire, and the lead food was the Antarctic explorations, I believe, of Shackleton. They attribute his and the crew's erratic behavior to large quantities of lead in their food. It was used a long time as an anti-knock agent in gasoline. That was phased out in both USA and Europe in the 2000 or by 2000. However, anecdotally, I still see a lot of it as a pilot because aviation fuel is still has an EPA waiver for lead, hunter acting lead. It is still in paint. There are still homes out there. You can't buy it, of course, but it is still in some older homes. Interesting, there was a CDC study conducted between 1976 and 1980, and the general population had a 70% higher than normal lead levels in the United States. What were the authors looking at? Their hypothesis. They believed that there was a connection between lead exposure and specific types of cancer. In the study, they addressed specifically kidney, lung, stomach, brain, and meningioma. The study that they basically put together was a longitudinal cohort study basically a yes or no, whether or not you were exposed and whether or not you wind up with one of these cancers. As it was looking at cancer, of course, there's no reference dose. There was also no cancer slope or incremental lifetime cancer risk assessed. It was just basically whether you were exposed and whether or not you end up with cancer. Although they did um, uh, break it down further to cancer exposure is a little or a lot. The study, and we will look at here, if you look at the chart, this is the numbers. They did start with about 81,170 women. These women were contacted between 1996 and 2000. They ended up with about 75,221. However, if you look at the chart, you will see that the numbers are a little bit lower. Again, with the men, you have 83,000. 33 after exclusion for various reasons, such as family history of cancer or cancer in the past. They wound up with 61,480. The men were contacted between 2002 and 2006. They were evaluated every 2 to 3 years until 2011. The lead exposures were evaluated as whether it was lead dust, lead fume, or both. The breakdown was because of the difference of bioavailability of each product being of different sizes. So the study, what did they find out? The data, we'll look at here. This is the meta-analysis summary. Of course, we have our reference rates above. Those are the people that have no exposure whatsoever. The ever group is those that are considered that had some exposure, but there was a significant period where they had none of like 10 to 20 years. And then low and high is broken down by the median exposure level, and those that were above the median were the high, obviously, and those that were below the median were the low. An interesting thing found on this, and the authors noted, is that looking at the combined exposure rate for the high levels, the reference rate was not higher than those that had no exposure. So obviously that information could not be used. Now this is combining both men and women. However, if we look at the meningioma rates, that was only looked at for women in this study. This meta-analysis will show the breakdown between men and women in both groups. So we have the SWHS would be the Shanghai Women's Health Study, and then the SMHS would be the men's study. Again, as only women were evaluated for the meningioma, that isn't on here. Again, we look at and see the high rates were for brain cancer in men was actually lower than the reference rate. So this information could not be included. So conclusions. What did the authors of the study found? Well, they did find that there was higher rates of cancers for those with high exposures and even with low exposures in kidney and brain cancer. And then with women, or higher exposure rates with meningiomas. So looking at problems that were identified, this was a small sample size, even though we're talking probably 150,000 combined people. The amount of people that actually had exposures and developed cancers were actually a very low subset of that number. So whereas we did find numbers that agreed with their hypothesis, obviously they're still limited, and we should look at higher numbers, especially across different groups. The other thing that they found is that, and this could be a problem in evaluation of the numbers, is that men represented a much higher group as far as tobacco use than women, which could obviously affect. We know that lead does have, or smoking does contribute to lead exposure. Another problem that the authors list is that a similar study done in the United States, a peer-reviewed study, showed that men actually showed a significant risk of meningioma and not women, while a study in Sweden showed that yes, men also showed a significant risk. However, there wasn't enough data to evaluate the women exposure. Okay, looking to the future, what do we need to do? Obviously, this is a problem that's not going to go away. If anything, it'll probably increase. We need especially look towards the developing nations where there is less protection from the oversight agencies such as the EPA, with increased use of these type of lead acid batteries. They will be produced in these countries where they don't have to follow those regulations. Another area that should be evaluated really is the shipbreakers in India. These are where old ships, large tankers, construction ships, um, container ships are taken, rammed on the beach, and then broken apart and sold off for scrap. A lot of these boats are very, very old, built prior to any type of regulations on lead or even built in areas where they didn't care. Um, so that should be looked at as well. Another question we should look at is this something that we could be evaluating with a rodent bioassay? Would that help? Is there a way to come up with a more pure sample group? One thing that is not well known is what is the link between lead and cancer? What's the mechanism of action that causes this increased risk? So this was initially going to be done in an APA format. However, Apple Keynote does not like APA format, at least for the reference. So whereas we would indent every line other than the first, every time I tried it, it went right back to this. And lastly, I always try and put a photo in of my daughters. They are my study buddies, my lab assistants, and they are my constant reminder of why I'm still in school and working hard towards finishing and going on to becoming a physician's assistant. So, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to hear from you any questions you may have.